I'm excited to introduce to you our speaker this morning, Pastor Jake Smith. Pastor Jake's been part of our pastoral staff now for a little while, serving as our global missions pastor. Over the last several weeks during the fall, Pastor Jake taught a 7-week, he ran out of time because he didn't finish, but he taught a 7-week Bible study on the book of Galatians, and he's going to take all of us back into Galatians for the next 2 Sundays. So this Sunday and next Sunday, we get to hear from Pastor Jake. What I love about Pastor Jake is he is just truly authentic. He's a reader. He is a deep thinker. And everything that he says, except for his offhand comments, which come on the cuff, which are always amazing, they're very well thought out. He is intentional about everything that he does, and he's going to be intentional with our time here this morning. So we give it up for Pastor Jake Smith, everybody.
I messed up my start. I got to start over from over here. I had it all perfectly, marked out. Yes, we had 7 weeks to go through Galatians. We had 7, 10, hour and a half long discussions. Probably needed 10 or 14 hour weeks, and I felt like I was racing through it. And so now, in the next 2 weeks, I've got 2 half-an-hour, time slots to cover the book. So if those of you who are in the class, you've heard this stuff, you can leave. Or you can wave your flag like, no, you said it different a few weeks ago. You can call me out. Just kidding. I'm excited to talk about this. Last night, though, we had the Speed the Light dinner and a show. And if you weren't there, plan to go next time we do it. It was fantastic. 2 stories from that have nothing to do with my message at all, but and really little to do with dinner and a show. But I sat with the Gilberts. And Miles, if you don't know, can eat. Miles likes to eat. And I'm an only child, so I don't relate to this, but I know when you've got lots of siblings, you kind of, food is something you fight over. It's a survival instinct. Well, he wasn't enjoying his pasta as much as we'd hoped, but so Jamal gave him a roll, just a roll, with lots of butter on it. And he went, he was so excited about this roll. It was the pearl of great price. What it was. It was amazing. He was so excited about this roll. He just was quivering. Butter, And then when it was cookie time, the plate gets shown over, and he just, And then of course he touched everyone. But he's just making a very deliberate decision. Like, I have to choose wisely. This is like the Holy Grail. If I drink from the wrong one, the ancient saint will kill me or whatever. But. Anyway, nothing to do with what I have to say, but a well-planned out, off-the-cuff message or joke. Anyway, and I have a note there. There you go. Miles has been covered. Galatians. Let me pray, and then we'll get started. Lord, thank you for this day, and thank you for your word and how it challenges us, how it equips us, how you make us better through it, how you speak to us. I pray that you would speak through me today and through the book of Galatians. Thank you, Lord. Amen. Galatians is a challenging book to preach from. Most pastors, when they do preach from it, it's just a couple of key passages, and they skip a lot because it's written to a very specific, it's written for us. I mean, it's relevant to us, but it's written to a very specific kind of time and place and issue, one that we deal with, we see, but it certainly would have been experienced differently from the original audience. Paul wrote it to the people of Galatia. Galatia was a province, but we still don't know exactly who he was writing to because it was this Roman province, but also it was an ethnic group. There were people from France, the Gauls, that came and settled in Galatia, and that's where you get the name of the province. So we don't know for sure if it was ethnic Galatians, the French, or if it was the province at large. It doesn't really matter, but it's something interesting to talk about and think about. Who was this for? Specifically, Paul, the story of it is this. I'll kind of try to set up the book a little bit this week, cover something from the book for this week, and then hopefully it'll make sense in the 2-week series that I'm doing. Paul has, Jesus has rescued him, has saved him, and he began his missionary life right away. Very quickly, he began preaching the gospel. And he has gone to Galatia, and he's preached the gospel, and it seems like he was there quite a while. Chapter 4 talks about how generous they were, how kind they were to him because he was sick. Something was wrong with him. And we think it was something with his eyes, maybe, because later on in the chapter, he says how he's touched by how kind they were to him, because what he thinks is gross. It's kind of yucky. So we assume it was on his feet, his hands, or his face, because that's what was visible. And the Galatians weren't turned off by this. Later on in the passage, it says that they would have plucked out their own eyes from him. They would have given him their very eyes. So it's possible, maybe likely, that there was something yucky going on in his eyes. Regardless, that made him stick around for a long time. He was in Galatia maybe longer than planned and got to be very close to them and was touched by their generosity and their kindness. He loved these people. He was not just an itinerant preacher passing through, but was there quite a while. Eventually he left, and he did establish churches, and there were pastors left behind to teach and continue the work that Paul had started. And then he continues on in his missionary journey and his work. And as was customary at the time, just like Jesus, other rabbis did this, Paul did this. Paul had his disciples, his team, his posse, if you will, that would travel around with him. Well, after he left and continued his ministry, someone else came through and started preaching a gospel that was different than what Paul had been saying. Paul had been preaching grace and righteousness by faith, that you don't earn your righteousness through obedience to the law. You earn your righteousness because of Jesus' grace, Jesus' work in our lives. Jesus has done it, not us. And then some people had come through and were preaching something different. Now, to be fair, Christianity was really confusing at this time. This is only a couple decades after Christ has died and resurrected and gone on. So Christianity is brand new. And the first Christians were Jews who had decided that they believed in Jesus. They'd accepted Jesus. They'd either seen him themselves or heard enough about him to say, yes, that is Messiah that the scriptures that we know, the Old Testament, have been pointing towards. And they accepted that and they believed that. Many people had seen Jesus. Many others had heard of Jesus, but no one had read Jesus. One, they were illiterate. Two, there wasn't anything written down at this point. Maybe some letters. The Gospels hadn't been recorded. There weren't Cliff's Notes being passed around. No one was tweeting anything. There wasn't a quick video on the news capturing something that Jesus had said. It was word of mouth. So either you were passing through and happened to hear him, happened to hear someone preaching about him, or someone you knew had traveled to where Jesus had been and then come back through your area on a trade route or something like that. So they're hearing little bits about Jesus. Little bits and pieces, and they're trying to put them together. So to be fair, it was confusing. And most Christians early on were Jews who had believed in Jesus, come to believe in Jesus, so they would go to synagogue and worship, but they would also pray to Jesus. And then, really around the same time, Peter receives this vision from the Lord. This blanket comes down, and the Lord says the gospel is for Gentiles as well. Completely a radical thought, because the Jews, the Lord was for them. They were his people, and that was it. And now Peter had to accept that, wait a minute, this has been for everyone all along. Really radical thought. Around the same time that happened, Paul, he meets Jesus as well. Now, he'd been persecuting Jesus, but he meets Jesus, and then he goes on to develop his thought, which is really what is a large portion of the New Testament, to begin to understand that, no, this is not a religion of works and law, but a religion of grace, right? This is a grace religion. So he has preached this in Galatia and then gone on to do his ministry elsewhere. Then someone else has come through. And the Galatians, it's likely that Paul knew who this guy was, this leader, and he had his disciples as well. But he refers to them as agitators and troublemakers. He's mad at this guy. But he's mad enough to not even name him. Like, you're nobody. And at the end, he's like, he kind of, in the conclusion of the letter, he says something to the effect of, don't bother me with this anymore. Like, I'm done with this guy. I'm done with this issue. He's mad at this guy. So he's an agitator. He's a troublemaker. So this letter is full of story, is full of confrontation. He takes on Peter and James, the pillars of the church, right? He takes them on. There's confrontation and conflict. There is deep theology. There's history. There's personal testimony. He gets emotional. He kind of goes off, and then he apologizes, and he says, well, I don't really apologize. He's all over the map because he feels deeply about the Galatians. They are his spiritual children. People he'd felt close to, people that had cared for him physically. Those of us who have felt very strong and then are weakened by a health issue, some kind of thing that all of a sudden now we're having to be cared for in ways we aren't used to as adults. That's humbling, right? That's a humbling experience. Well, Paul, this strong person, independent, courageous person, is now in the care of the Galatians. And they had loved him, and he loved them back. And now he feels they've turned their backs on him, and he's hurt by that. And all this is in this letter. It's a dynamic and rich letter. And we will just scratch the surface today and next week, but I'll do my best. So let's begin. Paul, in Galatians 1:1 and 2, he says this, Paul, an apostle, not from men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father. Here what he's saying is this, I am an apostle. In Paul's mind, an apostle is someone who has seen Jesus and been called by Jesus. So it's a short list of people at this point. So apostles are specifically people who had seen Jesus and been called by Jesus to preach. And he is saying, I am like Peter and James and John. I am like those people. I am an apostle. But I'm not an apostle because anyone said I'm an apostle, not through men nor through man, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father. Here, he's putting Jesus Christ and God the Father in the same place. A radical thought. Again, as the early Christians they're trying to figure out who is Jesus, right? How big of a deal is Jesus? We know he's a big deal. He's different than what we've been expecting in a Messiah. We're trying to figure this out. And here Paul begins to develop his kind of Trinitarian doctrine, this idea of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit being equal, all in one. Something that isn't specifically said, but it's certainly implied. This is the beginning of that thought in the book of Galatians. Jesus Christ and God the Father. And notice he puts Jesus Christ first, right? Key to this letter and to his theology, that Jesus Christ is essential, right? It's a big deal to go, Jesus Christ. The Son is before the Father. Well, for the topics of this letter, yeah, we need to talk about that. We need that to be established. So God the Father who raised him from the dead. Again, kind of alluding to the intentionality. This was on purpose. This was known that this was going to happen. God raised him from the dead. And then he says, and all my brothers. So I, Paul, and all my brothers. The brothers here are likely people the Galatians would know. So what he's saying is, everything you're about to read, they agree with me. And they're going to get an earful. Now, what happened at this day is Paul or someone would write a letter, and it would be routed through either maybe multiple copies would be sent out, or it would rotate through the churches and it'd be read aloud. Again, most people were illiterate, so someone would read this letter out loud. So when he wrote Paul, an apostle, and all the brothers, he's saying those people that were with me, those people that you know and love, that were there for so long, they're here with me. They know what I'm about to write, and they agree with me. Now, I forgot to say this earlier. What is likely to have happened, what seems to have happened, is Paul has gone to Galatia, has preached, has moved on. These other agitators, troublemakers have come onto the scene. They're preaching this other gospel, this other message, and someone thought, Paul should know about this, and ran to find Paul. We don't know where he was when he wrote this letter, but they let him know, hey, this is what's going on. This is what they're preaching. This is what they're saying about you. Paul seems to address some accusations throughout the letter. Some things that these agitators are accusing him of. And he's saying, Paul and I, me and these brothers who preached the gospel that we're about to discuss, that preached it then, they still agree with me, and they agree with me now, and they're here with me. To the churches of Galatia. So specifically to these people. Now again, we can learn some things from this letter to apply to our lives now, but it's important to understand the context of what the church was dealing with. They were Gentiles that had converted to Christianity, and then some Judaizers, some folks had come through and were preaching something different, and we'll get into that. So 11 through 18, chapter 1, verses 11 through 18. For I would have you know, brothers, that the gospel that was preached by me is not man's gospel. For I did not receive it from any man, nor was I taught it, but I received it through a revelation of Jesus Christ. For you have heard of my former life in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God violently and tried to destroy it. And I was advancing in Judaism beyond many of my own age among my people. So extremely zealous was I for the traditions of my fathers. But when he who had set me apart before I was born and who called me by his grace was so pleased to reveal his Son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with anyone, Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away to Arabia and returned again to Damascus. You see, Paul, in most of his letters, he acknowledges his story. His story was this. He was up and coming. He was the next big thing, and he knew it. He was from a family of means. He was incredibly well educated under Gamaliel. It would be maybe the best seminary in the world. He spent time being trained by Gamaliel, very respected and important figure in his life. And he was zealous. Paul at this time is known as Saul, and he is eager to serve the Lord. And he is righteous according to the law, and he knows it. And he sought out opportunities to persecute the church. In Acts 7 and 8, it records the story of Stephen being stoned to death, maybe the first Christian martyr. It says a young Saul stood over approvingly and guarded the coats. He was there, okay? He was there, and he persecuted the church. He sought out opportunities to do this. He believed that this Christian thing needed to be stamped out because he was zealous for the Lord, for his Father. He was zealous for Judaism, for his religion. And he persecuted the church violently and tried to destroy it. He was advancing among his peers. Again, he was the next big thing. He was that guy. And then the Lord called him. The Lord revealed himself to him. Again, he points to his apostleship, and his gospel is not receiving from anyone but besides the Lord. He got this message from the Lord. The Lord gave it to him. He received it from the Lord. What happened was he had requested orders and permission to go to Damascus to persecute Christians. And on the way, this is in Acts 9, on the way, the Lord appeared to him. Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? Well, who are you, Lord? I'm Jesus. And Jesus blinded him. So now this strong, independent, fierce advocate for the church, for Judaism, for his God, fiercely bold person now needs to be led by his hands. Right? He needs to be led where to go. And then he needs to get healed through the power of Jesus. So his mind is reeling. Right? His mind is reeling. The Lord has confronted him, has appeared to him, and is now redeeming him and forgiving him. So what does he do? It says near the end of that passage, I did not immediately consult anyone. So he didn't go to any of the other pillars, any of the other apostles. He didn't go to Jerusalem. When it says I didn't go to Jerusalem, he's saying I didn't go to the home office, the district office, to where the leaders are. I didn't go to them. Instead, I went to Arabia and returned to Damascus. Arabia, likely in this story, means he went to Mount Sinai. He goes to where God had appeared. God had spoken to his people at Mount Sinai. He had spoken to Paul at Damascus. He goes to these places where God has shown up before. It's a sure thing. God has been there. I want to go because I'm confused and God's got some explaining to do, right? Right? I was on the right track. Everything was going as it should go. I was persecuting the church. I was risking everything for the Lord. And now Jesus appears to me, confronts me, and forgives me, and calls me. What? Right? What? Makes no sense. God's got some explaining to do. So he goes to Arabia and returns to Damascus, these places where God had been real and visible and audible and spoken before. Then after 3 years, he went to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days. What's interesting about that, he finally, after some time, he's been preaching and doing his ministry. He is so unconcerned with station and position in titles that he vacillates between calling Cephas or Peter. He just doesn't really care. Like, what's your name again? Let's just get through this. He stays there 15 days, suggesting that, yeah, we went and we talked about some stuff, but I didn't get my message from him. I got my message from the Lord. So it's important throughout, as we get through, as you go into, especially the first couple of chapters of Galatians, to understand how important it was for Paul to establish his authority. The point is that Paul's authority as an apostle came from Jesus. One of the themes throughout Galatians is he's pressing them to stand firm. He is saying, stand firm. I know this is hard. Law is easier to understand than grace. It's easier to get a sense of how you're doing than it is in grace. I get it. I get that we have these thousands of years of Judaism and a couple decades at this point of Jesus, who we don't really know much about. He's a carpenter's kid. There's 1,000,001 rabbis traveling around. There are other people proclaiming to be Messiah. Do we know Jesus was, we don't know. We don't know. Trying to figure it out. I get it that it's hard. And then the Judaizers, the agitators, the troublemakers have come through and they've said it's Jesus and law. So there are a few laws that they were specific about. You've got to be circumcised. You've got to keep certain food laws. You've got to observe certain holidays, some religious rites. You have to do those things to be righteous. So Jesus and law. Now, there's a lot to talk about that, which we won't have time to discuss today and probably not next week either. But for Paul, it's important that it's Jesus only. It's either law or Jesus. If it's Jesus and law, then the cross is unnecessary. If Jesus didn't fulfill the law like he said he did, if he didn't wipe it all away, if I need to add to his sacrifice, if he isn't a complete sacrifice on his own, if he doesn't atone for my sins, if I still have to be circumcised, if I still have to observe certain food rules, etc., then Jesus didn't matter at all. And this is unacceptable to Paul. It's unacceptable because he has had this experience where Jesus saved him despite his righteousness, despite all he had done. That was nothing. In other letters, he will list the things he's accomplished and say it's dung. It's dung. It doesn't matter. What matters is Jesus. So Paul stood firm on his testimony because it was true and it had to be true, this experience of grace and righteousness. If you know me, you know I love a good story. I can't help but tell stories. Typically, when I start telling a story, it's connected to whatever we were just talking about. I quite often forget what we were talking about because I get so engrossed in the story. Sometimes I don't really care what we're talking about. I just got to tell the story. I collect them in a pile in my head. They're not organized in any way. And they just pop up out of nowhere. My best stories are not my own. I don't care whose story it is. If it's a good story, I'm going to retell it. I have sometimes heard a story and turned around and told someone else that story. You ever heard this story? I don't even know if it's true. I don't care. It's still a good story. I just love stories. And sometimes I do a good job, sometimes I don't. Some say that a story is something that has a beginning, a middle, and an ending, but not necessarily in that order. Have you heard that? Indeed, sometimes we've got to get to the end before we can understand the beginning, right? And so it's not uncommon to tell a story beginning, middle, ending, and then beginning again. Now, that's what we were talking about. Paul does that in this book. There's a couple of Old Testament passages where we may get to a little bit next week, but he goes back and he says, that thing that happened with Abraham, let's look at it through the lens of Jesus. Oh. So we go back to the ending, to the beginning after getting to the ending, which is really a new beginning with Jesus. I love a good story. They help us make sense of things. Frederick Buechner is one of my favorite authors. I recently listened to a speech of his, and like everything I've heard from him, it just is mind-blowing, and he writes so many things that you wish I could just write. If I could just write a paragraph like you write whole books of, I would be happy with my life. He's fantastic. He begins this message. He talks about paintings and photographers. And I've never appreciated paintings or photography the way I should. It's just not media that I enjoy as much or I've learned to understand. But he talks about how a good painter, he talks about one painter in particular who has painted this older woman, and not a particularly interesting older woman. He paints her, but by taking the time and the detail to do that so well, you now see this woman that you might not have noticed before. And in that painting, she becomes so incredibly seen. Someone took the time to see and to record what they had seen, and now we can see her in maybe we wouldn't have otherwise. Storytellers do that for us. They take the time to notice something and write it down, and we may have just glossed by it and not paid attention, and then we happen across the story and we go, oh, that is interesting. That is interesting. That is important. I didn't even realize that it was important until someone told the story. I'm not a musician. If you were there last night, you know that for sure. It's objective truth. I am not a musician. I love music. I love talking about music. I love telling stories about music or about musicians. And I love songs that tell stories, so it all comes together for me. Musicians talk about keeping time, right? You can't really do music. You can do punk rock without keeping time, but beyond that, you can't do music. And you have to be in time together. You have to keep time. And some songs are great stories. Not every song or every songwriter is a great storyteller. One of the great storytellers, I think, is Johnny Cash. He has the song One Piece at a Time. Anyone know that one? He tells a story about a guy who works, I think, at a Cadillac plant, and he wants a Cadillac but can't afford it, so he thinks, well, they won't mind if I take just one piece at a time. And so he sneaks things out in his lunchbox, some bolts and headlights, and over 20 years or so, he collects enough to finally build the car. And in the end, he has, I think it's a 49, 50, 51, 52, 53 automobile. So it's this Frankenstein of a car. It's a good story. Songs are connected to our stories, whether or not they tell a story. Quite often we can hear a song and we're jetted back in time to an event, right? And even if that song has nothing to do lyrically with that story, it's connected to it and we're reminded of it. Songs allow us to keep time, right? We're jetted back and all of a sudden that moment is held in that song and it's made permanent. It's given some substance. And now that thing, that event is so incredibly seen. Genesis 28 tells an interesting story. It's the story of Jacob and the ladder. Jacob is separated from his family and he's sleeping out in the wilderness, which was not common. No one had taken him in. He's camping for some reason. And he goes to sleep. He puts his head on a rock, uses a rock for a pillow. I've slept outside near rocks. I've never thought to use one for a pillow. It sounds awful, but that's what they did. So kudos to Jacob. And he has this dream about angels going up and down a ladder, right? It's a weird dream. And it could be a ladder, a stairway, or a ramp. It doesn't really matter. The word means all those things and all existed then. And then in 28:16 it says this, then Jacob awoke from his sleep and said, surely the Lord is in this place and I did not know it. The King James says, and I knew it not. Surely the Lord is here and I knew it not. You see, up to this point, Jacob had relied on his wits, right? And now, through this dream, he is aware of the Lord's presence. God is here. He is intersecting with us in this world. He is present. I don't just do things, but I'm connected, right? The Lord is present. See, Jacob was in a great story. He was in the presence of the Lord, and he didn't know it. So what does he do? He takes that pillow, that stone, puts it on a pillar, anoints it with oil. So then every time his people or he would walk past that site, and they walked a lot, right? They'd be walking and they'd say, see that pillar of rock there? You know what happened? The Lord appeared to Jacob, to our leader, right? The Lord appeared to Jacob, and he was there, and that's when we learned this. God was present. We didn't know it, and now we know it because of this crazy dream. And so by building that sculpture, that statue, that pillar, we have the story and we can keep time. We can look at that story and we can understand it and go, that's not just a nap in the woods. That's not just a good night's sleep or a bad night's sleep. It is something greater. It is the Lord's presence in our lives. Galatians 5:8 says this. He says, you were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth? This persuasion is not from him who calls you. And I want to point out specifically the him who calls you piece. When this would have been read out loud, this is the same language that Paul used in the beginning of the letter when he talks about being called to be an apostle and called to the Gentiles. They're the same kinds of words. And so to the listeners, to the Galatians, they've been hammered up to this point. This has been a tough letter to listen to. Even Peter writes about Paul's letters. They're difficult to understand. And again, this is a dynamic letter. Here, Paul says, him who calls you, in the same way he described his own calling. And this would have rhymed. The Galatians were going, what? What does that mean? What are you saying? He's saying a story doesn't need to have the drama of Paul's to be true and real and significant and eternally valued. A couple weeks ago, I happened to be downstairs with the babies, so I missed it, but the Teen Challenge folks were here. And we hear a lot of incredible, painful stories, hopeful stories. There's a lot of work left to do, but we hear stories of redemption and restoration. And those are good stories, and we need to hear those stories. And kudos to you. A great offering was taken for them. We appreciate that. But a story doesn't have to be a Teen Challenge story or a Paul story to be a good story, because he who calls you is the same. It all rhymes. And here's where we get Paul's point. I'm not the main character in the story. And neither is Paul, and neither are any of those students. It's Jesus, right? So Jesus and the Father, what he's making clear is this is about Jesus. He's saying your story matters, and you need to stand firm on it. It's going to be confusing. It's going to be hard. Band, you can come up. We need to keep the story. We need to hold on to it. We need to tell the story. It's a good story. It's a true story. The story of Christ coming into your life is the same story of Paul being rescued. It's the same story. Pastor Jim has been taking us through James. And a significant part of James talks about the tongue, right? The power of the tongue. This whole sticks and stones can break my bones business is not true, right? Words have power to destroy or to build up. And they can carry the presence of God, right? Just like Jacob sleeping on that rock, having that dream and building a pillar of rocks. Let your story be so incredibly seen and told. It's a story of faithfulness, a story of power, the presence of God in our lives, and of grace. 65% of the Bible is narrative. God likes stories, right? And like Miles with that biscuit and the butter, oh, look at this story, right? We keep our story, we tell our story, we stand firm on the grace that is revealed in our stories. This is Galatians for you, me, and us, right? So I want to conclude with the same benediction as near the end of the book. The grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with your spirits, brothers and sisters. Amen.